Good. All right, so before I get into the detail, I would like to first thank, of course, Federation University and Australian Carbon Innovation for hosting us all. Thank you very much, both of you. Thank you, both organisations. Of course, the dirty secret of being an academic is that your students teach you an enormous amount of stuff, and so do your colleagues. And so a lot of what I have to say today is very much the result of particularly hard work by many students over the years. The other dirty secret of academia is working with industry teach you an awful lot about how things actually function, particularly the work we've done with Ford, Caterpillar, and more recently the Future Fuels CRC. Some of you in the audience are working with these organisations yourselves. We've done a lot of work with these organisations on a whole bunch of different fuels, including hydrogen and things that you might make hydrogen into. And finally, the financial support of Ford, ARENA, and the Australian Research Council is the oil or the hydrogen that greases the wheels. But hydrogen doesn't grease wheels, does it? So it's the grease that gets the research done and enabling. So what do we mean by safe? It's actually quite a tricky thing. I was sitting there finalising my talk thinking, well, what do we mean by safe? Well, colloquial, common definitions: not in danger or likely to be harmed, not harmed or damaged. So, but we're all actually always a little bit damaged to a greater or lesser degree. And we're, of course, at all times, to some degree, in some degree of danger. Hopefully an aeroplane doesn't fly through this building in the next 20 minutes. But it might. So whilst these definitions make sense, we do need greater rigour in assessing whether something is safe. And in the language that's commonly used in industry, we don't so much use safe, we use risk assessment. In the financial markets, there's good risks and bad risks. You can get value out of risk. Generally, when you're talking about safety, I don't know many good risks when you're thinking about risk assessment and when you're talking about safety in general. And when we're talking about risk in general, we talk about something being the product of two terms: the consequence of something happening, in the case of safety, something bad going wrong, like someone getting injured or someone getting killed, times the likelihood of that happening. So we evaluate in a systematic way, hopefully, the risk of any given initiative by the consequences and the likelihood of some adverse outcome occurring. And then we might consider a risk to be acceptable if it is below some threshold. And that's quite interesting, because what is an acceptable threshold? And that's actually very much reliant on the kind of thinking that Peter highlighted previously. It's a complicated thing. So life is, we've got a lovely little equation, terrific. The engineers put an equation on board, that's great. Now we have to say, what do we mean by consequences? How do we quantify them? How do we quantify likelihoods? And importantly, how do we quantify acceptable thresholds? And it's actually very, very subtle and very involved, and it's a psychological question, and it's a social question, and it evolves in time, and it depends on many of our attitudes, and so on and so forth. So we have to, of course, respect that and appreciate it and work with it. So here's a question. Would you consider riding a motorcycle to be safe? Hands up who thinks riding a motorcycle is unsafe. All right? Hands up who thinks riding a motorcycle is safe. Okay, good. So there's a diversity of opinions. Hands up who rides a motorcycle. All right, there's fewer. Yeah. So I'm not making a value judgment on what's an acceptable risk of riding a motorcycle or not, but I'll give you some numbers. In Australia, about 1 in 5 road deaths are motorcyclists right now. And a motorcyclist is about 30 times more likely to be killed than other road users per kilometre travelled. That's just numbers from the Australian Bureau of Statistics saying these are road deaths, road injuries, and the distances that different vehicles travel. So if you go from A to B on a motorcycle, you're about 30 times more likely in Australia, on average, to be killed than if you did it in a car or a bus or a truck or something else. What about nuclear electricity? Who thinks that's unsafe? Well, very few hands. Who thinks it's safe? quite a few more. So I won't make a judgment once again, but I'll cite a work, a very controversial work by a fellow by the name of James Hansen, very famous climate scientist, one of the first people to really raise the alarm on a lot of this stuff. He argues that nuclear electricity currently saves about 70 to 80,000 people per annum globally, relative to if we shut down all of those nuclear power stations and replace them with fossil fuel power stations. So of course those fossil fuel power stations injure and kill people in many ways, like coal mining, which underground coal mining is, for example, relatively unsafe compared to open cut coal mining, but also the coal-fired power stations put pollutants up to the atmosphere, which people ingest in the environment and so on and so forth, and that causes disability, disease and early mortality is the formal phrase. So quite remarkably, that analysis of that 70 to 80,000 people per annum includes the deaths of Chernobyl and Fukushima. Now, I don't know if he's right or wrong. It's certainly very controversial, but something to give you pause to think about what do we mean by safety. Motorcycles, I think that one is probably probably greater consensus on whether or not you should ride motorcycles, or as I get older, whether or not my son should ride a motorcycle. That's the thing I'm worried about. But on nuclear, that's an interesting one. So what about hydrogen? Well, and this is the key. Is it safe? Is it unsafe? Well, I'd argue that's not really the right question. The question really is how safe is it relative to alternatives? And here's a chart that's looking very much at road transport, and actually more specifically passenger vehicle transport. And here we start on the left-hand side with all the different energy resources: oil, conventional, unconventional, biomass, natural gas, coal, renewables and nukes. And then we've got our secondary energies here: liquid fuels, electricity and hydrogen. And then we've got the propulsion system that's in different kinds of vehicles, from the good old conventional gasoline or diesel fueled car all the way through to FCEVs and BEVs and the various hybrids that are out there. So you can see there's many different pathways. And we all know, we can all think of instances, I'm sure, where one of those pathways from left to right would involve things that we would perceive as risks. Okay, so if it was an electric car taking renewable electricity, solar, wind or hydro into electricity to go into your electric car, we'd say, well, you might get electrocuted in an electric car, or maybe the battery would catch on fire, for example. Similarly, if it's a conventional gasoline car, you might have a cigarette at the service station, unadvisedly, or you might have an accident, rupture the tank, and the tank catches on fire. Unlikely, it doesn't happen too often actually, but the risks associated with that. Well, of course there are risks associated with the production, the distribution and the use of hydrogen, as there are with any other energy vector. So how safe is it? Well, it depends on how you use it, therefore. For example, we can look at all these different energy vectors. Forget about natural gas at the moment, because our primary use of that is in industry and in heating in our homes and businesses. Forget about that one for the moment. But here I've classified all of these different energy vectors by a bunch of different criteria which are relevant to the safety question, right? And by a plus, I mean this particular energy vector relative to gasoline or diesel is comparable to or better. Doesn't mean it's better, it might just be it's kind of the same. A minus means worse than gasoline or diesel, because these being the incumbent fuels that we often think about. And then plus or minus means, well, depends on how you use it. So if you think about electricity, well, you don't burn electricity, so that's non-applicable. A lot of the NA is here because electricity is not a liquid or a gas, or is it? No. But if you look at, for example, hydrogen here, it's more flammable than gasoline and diesel. By flammable, I mean you can set it on fire in much more dilute mixtures than you can gasoline and diesel or natural gas, and in much more rarefied air mixtures that we call those rich in the combustion world, lean and rich. So very dilute mixtures of lots of hydrogen in air, so a little bit of hydrogen in lots of air, or or lots of hydrogen, a little bit of air, it will burn over a wider range of air-fuel ratios than gasoline or diesel. So as a safety thing, that's a concern because, for example, if I'm starting to leak hydrogen, it starts dissipating as it gets to Peter, and if Peter's having a cigarette, then that might ignite, whereas if I were leaking gasoline for the same air-fuel ratio to you, it probably wouldn't ignite, for example. I'm not leaking hydrogen or gasoline at the moment. Hot air, yes. And what about density? That's an interesting one because hydrogen, as you know, is a light gas. So if you get a leak, it tends to go straight up. It's got a molecular weight of 2 compared to air, which is about 29. So it's about, 14 or 15 times lighter. So you get a leak and it goes straight up in the air. Now, if you happen to be standing next to a fuel cell vehicle or a cryogenic plant turning gaseous hydrogen to liquid hydrogen, and you get a leak, it goes straight up, which means it doesn't go near you necessarily. Compare that to propane, liquefied petroleum gas, which is heavier than air. It's got the same molecular weight as CO2, but it burns unlike CO2. I mean, if you get a leak of propane, like you might in the back of the boot of your car if you're running on an LPG, in your garage, it leaks out and it settles down and fills your garage. And the next morning you come out with said cigarette and up she goes, right? So actually I think propane, beautiful fuel by the way, we've burnt that one as well, is actually quite an unsafe fuel in certain applications because it's heavier than air and it's quite easy to ignite. Natural gas, lighter than air, quite hard to ignite actually, so better than gasoline and diesel, so on and so forth. But you can't see lots and lots of pluses there for hydrogen. But there are some pluses, there are some minuses, but there are some pluses and some minuses on most of those. But of course, safety is not the only thing that we worry about when it comes to fuels. There are these little things like costs and utility. So how good is hydrogen relative to other fuels? So by the way, a very safe fuel would be one that doesn't ignite. By that logic, water is a very, very safe fuel. Unfortunately, it's a very, very bad fuel because it doesn't ignite. So a lot of these metrics that we think we want are the desirable things from a safe fuel are the exact reason we don't use things because it makes them poor fuels as well. So if we look at all these different options once again, and we think about the greenhouse performance, the other environmental health impacts, the cost, the scale, Alan talked about the scale, do we have enough of it to really make a dent? Is it easy to use in our current supply chains? Is it convenient for customers? Well, look at electricity. Well, if we got, for example, electricity from a Victorian brown coal power station, put it into my Tesla and drove it around, that would have higher greenhouse gas emissions than driving the equivalent car on gasoline. So it could be worse on a greenhouse perspective or better if I charged it fully from renewables, for example, or from a coal-fired power station with CCS, of course. Now, some pluses, some minuses on all of them. So there is no clear winner in this whole discussion. Hydrogen has some attractive features and some less attractive features, particularly when it comes to ease of integration and consumer utility. So closing thoughts. Hydrogen is commonly used already. And that's the thing we need to remember. It's particularly used in industry. There'll be people here who will know for sure. I think the single largest consumer of hydrogen right now in this country is crude oil refining. Is that right? Okay. So they take natural gas from the Bass Strait, put it in a pipe underneath the Brear refinery, put it in a pipe up through under Port Phillip Bay, I should say. Over there, then they crack it, they steam methane reform it into hydrogen and then use that to take sulphur out of crude oil as we make gasoline and diesel, and also to what we call hydrogenate it to boost the octane of the fuel as well. That's the single largest industrial use, but there are many others. But it's used a lot in industry. But hydrogen, as was pointed out earlier today by Patrick, I think it was 1967 we made the flip from town gas to natural gas in Victoria. That gas was maybe not 50% hydrogen, but not far off it. So we were using it. And actually, those bad old days of ovens not being turned off and people dying as a result wasn't due to the hydrogen, it was due to the carbon monoxide that was in the syngas, which is a toxic gas. And then we also have, of course, safety standards that exist for many aspects of the hydrogen supply chain. So it's a commonly used industrial gas. But it's not inherently more or less safe than many of the other energy vectors and feedstocks that we use. So as a result, we need to step back from it a little bit and say, well, what's the relative risk of its greater use? The relative risk of switching from an incumbent fuel to hydrogen is the key concern. So we would say, will we have fewer injuries or fatalities, or will we lose more money, or so on, but through the greater use of hydrogen? And the answer to that, of course, disappointingly, is application specific and depends on many factors, which we're talking about today. So thank you very much.